You know, in like children's books and movies are like, oh, the power of love was the secret answer all along, and everybody's like, ah, oh, bad writing, that's like, that's a cop out, that's lazy. What if it's such an incredibly common theme because love is actually the thing that powers everything? Like, I know it's cheesy, but like, sit with that. What if that, what if it is actually about the power of love? Okay, I love this conversation. So, music I think of as, first of all, completely political. So, yes, it gets commodified, but in exactly the same way that we as human beings get commodified in our society, right? So, there's a very interesting article actually by a person, Suzanne Cusick, called like On a Lesbian Relationship with Music. And it basically talks about like music topping and bottoming. And like you have an intimate engagement and interaction and experience with, and there's another term that's really helpful here, which is by Christopher Small, called musicking, which kind of turns it into more of a verb. So the thing that we mistakenly think of music as a distant object, as something we can write down. Like the sheet music is not the music. The sheet music is an object, and it's a representation of how to play the music, but it's not the actual music, right? And so I love Small's idea of musicking, because it's this idea that actually, no, music is an act. It's a thing that you're involved in, whether you're the composer, whether you're the audience, the person playing the music, whether you're improving with a group, everybody's kind of like bouncing off of each other. That's all like a social kind of engagement. It's 12/12. I love it. I also think of music as energy. And if you think of people as being channels of energy, we operate in a very similar way. I also think we can talk about it in terms of subjectivity and objectivity, and thinking about music as its own subjective, having its own subjective experience, not necessarily being conscious, but allowing it to be something that is not separate, that is not distant. That's so music is a fungible commodity. Sure, so am I, right? This is welcome to capitalism. So am I. And is it art? What even is art? I think art, again, is just political. So it's, again, just all part of this whole social experience. Yeah. So when you think, is it more like a tree or is it more like a rhizome? Quick refresher for anyone who hasn't been in a high school science class recently. A rhizome is one of these bad boys. Basically, it's a kind of plant stem with a whole network of underground roots and shoots that are connected by multiple nodal points, each of which can produce a new part of the plant that grows above ground. So Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari are two awesome guys who wrote a book together in which they proposed the rhizome structure as a model for a new way of thinking. And they compare their rhizomal model of thought to previous models that they call arboreal. An arboreal model is named for its structural resemblance to a tree. It has a clear beginning like a root, which builds in a hierarchical sequence using binary categories to reach its conclusions. The rhizome, in contrast, deals instead with planar movement and connections where no point is higher than others and none represents a conclusion or a beginning. Also, the rhizome's points of connection are related by a process of becoming. Becoming is a state of interaction between the connected points or nodes of an assemblage. Rather than being a whole that then contains connections, Deleuze and Guattari describe an assemblage and the becoming of its materials as the outcome of a process of connections. So if you're thinking rhizomally instead of arboreally, what that means is that you can conceptualize an entire network of connections which are becoming, rather than a linear and binary path toward progress. And the reason why this is so important is because some of the most fundamental truths about humanity lie in that process of becoming. All right, I'm going to try to explain a little more about Lacan, and hopefully it will get at your question. So, according to Lacan, a child is not even capable, first of all, of knowing what it wants before it enters into the symbolic order and can use language. And until that point in time, by trying to name and categorize the baby's needs, the parents are actually creating the reasons why the baby is uncomfortable or whatever. So for example, if a parent responds to its baby's crying with food and that solves the problem, then they're going to assume that whatever that discomfort or pain was retroactively determined as meaning hunger. So meaning in this situation is determined not by the baby, but by other people around the baby on the basis of the language that they speak. So Lacan says that most children, and interestingly, he makes an exception for autistic children, but most children, he says, assimilate the other as language. And now he uses a word other with a capital O, which he basically uses to mean language and the law and the symbolic order, like whatever all that is together is the other with a capital O. The other can be seen as insidious, but at the same time, it allows us to communicate, so it's like a necessary evil. And according to Lacan, every person who learns to speak is alienated from themselves because when we speak, the meaning in the words comes from ego. So it's not really reflecting us. And Lacan is really clear that the self is an other and the ego is an other. Not the capital O, but the lowercase o, something else. In other words, others may know us better than we know ourselves, and so the notion of the self begins to break down. And Lacan also believes that language makes up the unconscious. So when he's interpreting Freud, he basically thinks that when repression takes place, a word or a part of a word kind of sinks underneath your consciousness, metaphorically, and it still can be used and isn't necessarily inaccessible, but it takes on a new role through being repressed and establishes relations and connections with other repressed elements. So that becomes your unconscious. And Lacan says that the unconscious is structured like a language in the sense that it obeys a kind of grammar. And so it's therefore filled with other people's desires and ideas, which flow into and through us through discourse. So I hope that gets at least the first part of your question. The second part, are we responsible for what we think or what we do? I really take that as kind of opposite from you, and I really think we are responsible to each other for what we do. We're responsible for our actions and how they affect the other people in this with us, because we're all one. We're all one thing. But your reality totally does affect others because we live in a society. We're all part of the same collective. We're all one thing. And this idea of solipsism in spirituality has a long history. A lot of people, and it's a big part of what causes spiritual psychosis, is thinking, recognizing some of these signs of the matrix and thinking that that means that you're the only one that matters, and thinking that everybody else is like some kind of pawn or object in your game. That's the exact opposite of how it works. We're all one thing. We are all subjective. And it's specifically cutting us off from source and ungrounding us to think of ourselves as individuals, because that's all based in ego. As opposed to more collectively. I do think people should find their own paths, but mistaking yourself for the only person here, the only person that matters, is going to be an obstacle on anyone's healing path every time. Let's talk about postmodern divination, aka why divination works better since coronavirus. In chapter 2 of The Order of Things, daddy of gay philosophy Michel Foucault describes an important difference in how thought worked before the Renaissance as opposed to after it. According to Foucault, Western cultural knowledge and meaning used to be constructed through resemblance, which meant that everything in nature could be interpreted as a single, unified mesh of interlaced meaning. Foucault points to this as a reason why magic and scholarship were so intertwined, because when the system of signs or symbols is closed in this way, knowledge is equivalent to interpretation, and so divination, the practice of reading and interpreting the symbols, leads to real, meaningful knowledge. But then, writing became privileged in the West, and the spoken word, marked female in contrast, was stripped of all its powers as writing was seen as concrete truth. So while pre-Renaissance thought had stayed cohesive through resemblance, the system was destabilized and reformed as a binary understanding of meaning that struggled to link signs to the things they signified. In the 20th century, when Foucault was writing, the best available answer became analysis of signification and meaning, but this was not a perfect solution as we continue to slip into the ideology of meaninglessness that is postmodernism. Around this period came the industrial age, and with it the onset of another masculine-coded filter: standardized time. Because it demanded primacy over space, time obscured and minimized the importance of space in the same way that the written word obscured and minimized the importance of the spoken word. But in both cases, the feminine-coded mirrors of these filters still exist. They continue to simmer underneath the surface level of Western culture, passed down through maternal lines and localized ways of being and knowing, surviving in spite of erasure. Hasn't time stopped working the same way since the pandemic? Don't you feel it too? A week stretches into a million years and a year fits in a day. None of our schedules are standardized. They're as unique as our algorithm-curated media diets. Time stretches and folds in on itself like taffy. And here we are on TikTok, sharing with our voices. So of course divination is working better. A sound walk is a guided exercise in active listening, like a tour of the aural world you live within. Sound walks are common in music appreciation classes because they can help you to expand your understanding of and your sensitivity to the sound environment around you. An initial sound walk will be helpful in beginning to attune your ear to the sound vibrations around you and to more consciously and intentionally engage with your own active listening. But you may also benefit from regular sound walks to continue to exercise and hone your listening over time. The concept of sound walks was first introduced by Hildegard Westerkamp in the 1970s, but throughout my time as a music student and teacher, I've encountered several different iterations of the process. The method outlined here is an amalgamation of elements from these that I personally think are most effective, but you might choose to follow a different guiding approach or modify this one in whatever way feels right for you and for your magic. Happy listening. Let's talk about alchemy in Baroque and Surrealist music and art. J.S. Bach was a bastion of the classical music canon, so most people probably think of his and his contemporaries' music as mundane, even rational. But would it surprise you to learn that Baroque music actually has close ties to alchemy? Matthew Greenbaum explains that many of the composers and theorists in Bach's circle considered contrapuntal skill as an equivalent to alchemical research. Although there isn't a record of Bach discussing alchemy, evidence of his connection to it lies in the music itself. The musical offering is a clear example of alchemical music. The work includes 10 examples of learned canons with esoteric notation. A few of them only show one part with Latin instructions to discover the entry points of the canonic voices, such as the puzzle canon, which can be read by players facing each other across a table. Note the inverted clef at the end, signifying that the canon is a retrograde inversion. Johann Thiel's Book of Art is similarly alchemical. For example, the Harmonischer Baum, harmonic tree, is actually a 10-part canon, which may remind us of the Tree of Life diagram or the Philosopher's Tree, both central Hermetic symbols. Alchemy continued in the Surrealist movement in both music and art. Even on the surface, the visual works of Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, Alberto Savinio, and Giorgio de Chirico, among others, were rich with alchemical symbolism. The Marquis de Sade and Sigmund Freud were also both points of fascination for the Surrealists. Their interest in these two men encouraged the creation of many taboo and disturbing psychosexual juxtapositions, particularly conflations of sex and death. Peter Webb writes, like de Sade, the Surrealists also understood eroticism to be the dynamic behind the most intransigent expressions of subjectivity: revolt, hysteria, perversion, and crime. Unleashed eroticism, they conceded, led to excess, blasphemy, subversion, even the bloodletting of the sadistic act. Bethany Latimer explains that Surrealists shared a goal of social revolution through the liberation of the individual's psyche, and that for them, this goal was symbolized by woman's values because they were seen as contrary to dominant social values. Appropriation of the feminine is a common tactic of Surrealist artists, but Latimer points to a fundamental contradiction. Breton and the other Surrealists believed in sanctification through the mystical or divine quality of the monogamous love of a woman, according to the Platonic concept of finding your other half, which is antithetical to the notion of woman as a means of cultural change or liberation because it strengthens patriarchal structures. In other words, the Surrealists were seeking the Philosopher's Stone, and they thought that feminine energy had the key to liberation and everlasting life, but instead of lifting up women, they tried to appropriate our power. Stick a pin in this idea. I think it's really important. This is interesting to me too, because I think that the smarter an algorithm is, the more likely it is to reflect like a mirror the people that made it, in a similar way to how I think the more healed that people become, the more we ourselves become like mirrors of each other, of the people that we encounter, who in turn project onto us whatever's going on with them and kind of work it out through a dialogue with us, but really it's like a mirror back to themselves. But anyway, I think this can make algorithms really dangerous because, similar to how we treat science, we can accidentally or falsely think of these things as objective when they're really not. They're actually reflecting our subjectivities. So I think ignoring that they are subjective, or ignoring the political context of them and trying to displace or remove them from that context, is the dangerous part. And the way around that is to do a lot of this self-exploration and healing that I talk about in order to be responsible with the power of creating something like that.